Good morning.
Trying again. I'll peek over your shoulder at the bathroom.
Good morning.
Benny,
Good morning.
can you hear? Can you see? Is it good?
I can't see anything.
Can you hear properly? I'm gonna have two devices. Give me put in the one in the chat. We'll start in in 5 minutes. 6:05.
Okay, yeah, no, the hearing is also very choppy, Rabbi.
It's gonna have to work with one of them.
That's the way it was
We're
last
starting in
week.
5 minutes, okay.
We're starting in 5 minutes.
Good morning. We're good? The hearing is good?
Yes, it is this Sunday.
Thank
Thank
God.
Thank God.
Thank God. Okay. I'm gonna figure this out. Okay. I'm gonna set up another camera here, but we're basically okay. Okay, Baruch or Danny, whoever I can see. If at any point the sounding goes bad, just go like that, and I'm gonna put on another device. I'll go back and forth. But so far, so good. Okay, great. Guys, an intro. Whoever has a chumash, and good morning to Baruch's relative over here. Welcome to Bruce's relative. Whoever has a chumash, if you open up a chumash, you're gonna appreciate this much more. That you can't compare. There's a special geschmack in learning and seeing how the halacha, the Torah Shabbat Peh, is derived from the written Torah. We are going to go into a chumash, mamish, the beginning of Vayikra. I'm telling you, we read this, we hear this every year, Monday and Thursday, and you're going to see how it's mamish, masuk, midvash, every word in the chumash. Okay, if you have your chumash open, mamish, the beginning of Vayikra, Vayikra Aleph, we're going to go through psukim, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 13. All right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yoma Daf Chav Zayin. We finished learning the Mishnah on Daf Chavav on the days that finished by saying that the hefshet and the nituach, that the flaying and the dismemberment of all of the karbanos does not need to be done by kohanim. So when we were finishing the chapter and we went through already in Mishnayos the 4 lotteries, the 4 payasas, nothing is mentioned, not about the flame, nor about the dismemberment, because indeed it does not have to be done by kohanim. Where do we get that from? And we're going to learn basically the whole Amud Aleph will be a teaching of Chizkiah. The Gemara is going to reject the teaching of Chizkiah, and we will find we're going to learn how to learn Chumash. And the Nukuda will be is that when we read something in the Chumash, you always have to focus on what it says and on what it does not say. And from the implication of what it does not say, we're going to learn that these 2 steps, again, the hefshet and the nituach, does not need to be done by kohanim. We will also have on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph the source that when it comes to the bringing up the parts, the animal parts of the lamb, we have a total of 6 kohanim. If you remember, the 5 kohanim, the 5 parts where we had actually 4 or 5 opinions in Tanoim, what comes before what. And then we had the 6th was the intestines. So previously we didn't speak about the intestines because everyone agrees it comes after all the animal parts go up. The intestines actually both by the lamb and then when we learned about the ayol and about the part, they're all equal. After all the parts go up, then goes up the intestines. But the bottom line is that the intestines needed to go up. What came up after the intestines? You guys remember the Mishnah? Then you had the soilus, you had the minchas chavitin, and the yayin. So if we're focusing on the animal with the intestines, it's 6 by a lamb, and we're going to have a source from the Chumash, whether it's a Doiraisa, whether it's an Asmachta, that's all important. And on that Chav Zayin on the days, we're going to have a statement of Rabbi Yochanan. We initially had what we thought he said, and what we thought he said in the beginning is that if a non-Kohen will arrange, will be Mesader de Ma'aracha. Now the Sidur HaMaracha, we say this every day by Abaya Hava Mesader, is like we mentioned, you have to make a seder. You have to put the ashes where they belong. You had a large pyre that needed to be organized. You needed to have a second pyre, right, the Maracha Shniya, from where they took the coals to burn the ketairis. All of that has to be done by a kohen. So Rabbi Yochanan said that if a non-kohen does it, he's chayav misa. And if you remember, what did we learn about? What's the criterion for which, if a zar does the avodah, he's chayav misa? The 2 dinim, right? Number 1, it has to be what we call a avodas matana. It has to be an avodah of placement. And number 2, it has to be a avodah tama. It has to be a concluding service. So do we view the arranging of the maracha as a concluding service? It's not so simple. Because really, after they organized the maracha, then both in the morning and in the afternoon, there needed to be a kohen placing the 2 blocks of wood. Remember, in the morning, one kohen brings up the 2 blocks of wood. We'll learn these details. In the afternoon, 2 kohanim, each one brings up another block of wood. Do we view that step as the final step, or do we view that as the new morning step? So we're going to see whether Rabbi Yechanan says whether the Zor was misader the maracha, he's chayav misa, and then we'll have a clarification that Rabbi Yechanan really said that if a non-kohen puts the 2 blocks of wood, which comes after the Siddur HaMaracha, that Zor will be chayav misa. And then from the statements of Rava, we're going to have an implication that Rava clarifies why is it that for certain things we made a lottery and for certain things we did not? Like, what is it? So Rava implies, he doesn't say it explicitly, that there are 2 rules. Number one is, it has to be an avodah for which a non-kohen is chayav misa. Ooh, that's chashiv. And number 2, it has to be a daytime avodah. And an avodah that's considered a nighttime avodah, even if a zor doing it will be chayav misa, it's not important enough for us to make a lottery for it. That will be the daf. It's moedik, and especially for people who begin to appreciate, as we should, how we derive the oral Torah, or where do we see the oral Torah in the written Torah, it's mamash going to be amazing. So whoever has a chumash can die to open up a chumash. We left off in the Gemara on Daf Chavav Amid Beis, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid, by the beginning of the Gemara. And in the chumash, I want to read the chumash inside. Now, I don't have a good chumash, I have my good old chitas. So I'm going here. The pasuk speaks about the korban oila. The Torah speaks about whether an oil is coming from the bakar type, from the animal type called cattle. And then the Torah speaks about if the korban oila will come in hatsoin, flax, and flax includes both sheep and lambs. Now, guys, I know that we're speaking about the korban tamid comes from a lamb. Fine, but let's go on the pash. So in Vayikra Aleph, in the beginning, the Torah, pasuk Dalet, we'll go through it quickly. The Torah speaks about, this is about a private oil, and there's a mitzvah of smicha that the owner, if the owner is a man, should lean with both of his hands on top of the head of the animal with all of his might, and then now the Torah does not say the word kohen. We're looking for when does the Torah say kohen and when does the Torah not say kohen. So for smicha, of course, not a kohen because it's the owner that does the smicha. Pasuk 5, v'shachat es ben abakar lefnei Hashem. Here also you don't have a mention of a kohen, and we already learned indeed that shchita does not need to be done by a kohen, even though when there's a communal carbon, the first step of the second payos was shchita, because it's better for a kohen to do it, but it doesn't have to be done by a kohen. Now, the first time you have the words kohanim is v'hikrivu, bringing near, and bringing near means from the receiving of the blood further. V'hikrivu b'nei Aharon hakaram asadam, bringing near Kabbalah and the Zarku Asadam al Mizbeach Saviv Asher Pesach Choyel Moyer. You see, pasuk 6, no mention of kohanim, no mention. The hifshet as oila, you flayed the animal, right? You skinned it. Step number 2 is what we are discussing. V'nitach oisel l'nosacha, and you dismembered it. All right. Then no mention of kohanim. In pasuk 7, back to the mention of a kohen. V'nosnu b'nei Aharon hakohen eish al mizbeach. They would put fire on the altar. You see kohanim, and look at the end of pasuk Zayin. No mention of kohen. And they would arrange the woods on the fire. No mention of kohanim. Why not? And in pasuk 8, weiter, yes, kohanim. They would arrange the parts, the pieces, and the 2 that are mentioned is the head and the fats, right? Which is mamish superfluous. You know, you already mentioned that there's wood and there's fire on the altar. And in pasuk 9, we're speaking about the intestines. They are placed on the altar, but it's not bachavadik to place them when they are filled with the physical, waste, so that it was clear, it was cleaned out in the chamber for the cleaning it out. And yes, then it was brought up on the altar. Again, the word kohen. So you were going back and forth. You have certain steps in which the Torah does not mention kohen, and really there are 3 steps in which the kohen is not mentioned. Shchita, it's not mentioned by the hefshet and the nituach, and the 3rd time that kohen is not mentioned is va'archu eitzim al ha'esh. Now we will also be using, when the pasuk goes on, when it speaks about if the animal is coming from the category called soim. Soim means flocks. Soim means if it's not a baka, not cattle, if it's made out of sheep or if it comes from goats, then the pasuk goes through the same steps. And we will focus on one verse, verse 13, pasuk Yud Gimel. There again, we're speaking about the cleaning of the intestines, right? Pasuk Yud Gimel. And again, the hikriv hakoyin es hakoil. He brings it near the hiktin hamizbecha. We're going to focus on pasuk Yud Gimel because pasuk Yud Gimel emphasizes two steps: the bringing of the intestines and the burning of the intestines. That detail you don't have in pasuk 9. In pasuk 9, it says that the kirboy and the chirav should be washed out and burnt. Now, of course, to do the haktara, you have to bring it near. But you don't have the steps of vehikriv, vehiktiv. Yes, you have that in pasuk Yud Gimel. Okay, Chavim, once we have that, now people who don't have a chumash, or if we're not ready for the step, that's fine. But when you have a chumash, gaval. So let's go with the Gemara. So Tana, we learned in a brayso. What are we looking for? How does the Mishnah know? How do we know that the flame and the dismemberment does not need to be done by a kohen? Tana, we learned in a brayso. Have shaitan v'nituach shavin bizar. Mamish the same, similar to the words of the Mishnah. It could be done by a non-kohen. So says the Gemara 2 lines before the end. Where do we get that from? Shenemar, because since it says v'nosnu b'nei aharim hakoyin eish al hamizbeach, where do we have the pasuk of fire? We have that in pasuk 7, and it finishes. And the pasuk prior, pasuk 6, doesn't mention the word koyin. Now this is the premise. Based on the mention of the kohen on pasuk 7, based on it being superfluous, we'll see why, or we'll see if it's not needed for itself, then it's coming to teach a inference, and the inference is that the placing of the fire has to be done by a kohen, but the step prior does not need to be done by the kohen. What's the step prior? Pasuk 6. What's pasuk 6? Hefshet and itoch. So the Bnei Adonai Kahanim have to place fire on the mizbech. The way we learn from inference is when something is extra. If something is needed for itself, then you can't learn two things. You learn what it says and not in between the lines. So Daf Chav Zayin asks the Gemara on Chizkiah, 1 second. No. Hi, no. The Torah has to tell you that if fire needs to be put on the altar, the fire has to be done by a kohen. Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi, that I once found Ashkachte la Abaya. Abaya was learning with the son, and the Haver Masbele Lebrei, and he was actually expounding the teaching of Chizkiah. So this is what I overheard. So Abaya began a couple of steps prior. That when you see in Pasuk 5, when it says V'shachat, as we mentioned, and there in Pasuk 5, the word B'nei Aharon HaKoyanim is only mentioned after the V'shachat, by the V'hikrivu. So Abai is telling his son, when it says V'shachat, Shchita V'zor Kishem, and he explains himself, V'chima Ayin Basa, how do I know that? Because Mechlal Shenema. No, he said like this. Really, there's a problem on that, because since if you jump ahead to Parshas Koirach, what does it say in Koirach Va'ato V'necha Itcha Tishmeru Askol Naschem, that you only Kohanim should safeguard all of the steps of the Avodah? Only having that pasuk later, Shemei, I would have thought, Afilu Shchita, every step can only be done by Kohanim. So that's why coming back to our Parsha, Talmud Loimer V'shachat ben Abakar Lifnei Hashem, and in the middle of the same verse, in the next step of bringing near, it says, V'hikrivu b'nei Aharon HaKahanim es Adam. If the Torah is mentioning, either never mention Kohen, and we will rely on what it says in Koirach, or mention it in the beginning once. No, in middle of the pasuk after the shechita, then you mention kohanim. Aha, mikabalas ve'elach mitzvahs kohuna, and that is megale. That reveals that when you go backwards now, and we're going even back to pasuk 4, that when it says v'samach yadai, when it says in the beginning of pasuk 5 v'shachat, here limit al shechita sheksheda bizar gevaldik. That's what Abaya. This is how Abaya expounded the intro to. Now we're going to come to Chizkiah, and now Abaya continued. So we already clarified that the smicha by the owner, clear. The shchita, like the smicha, can be even by a non-kohen, but from bringing the blood close, mikabala ve'elach, now you have to have a kohen. Now, if every step from now onwards is only by a kohen, then there should be no need to ever mention kohen again. That's it. Everything else is by a kohen. The Torah should only go through the steps. So now, says Abaye, behold, mikabala ve'elach mitzvahs kahuna. So why is it that the Torah has to write? And now we're jumping to pasuk 7. V'nosnu b'nei aharon, that they put the fire. That's what Chizkiah was coming to say. We already know that. It already says v'hikrivu b'nei aharon ha'kohanim. So normally, it is extra. So when the Torah writes something that we would have known, God is writing it, not to tell you what it says, but what it implies something. Only now do you need to have a kohen. Because the step prior to it, you did not need a kohen. L'ma'utei, pasuk 6, hefshet v'nituach. Point, nikuda. Now we have at least a better appreciation of that which Chizkiah said. The Gemara, after all this, will reject it. Says the Gemara, hold on. Ve'akati, but yet I'm not satisfied. The words in the opening of pasuk 7 is itzrach, it's needed. It's not superfluous. Something is not extra. You cannot infer from it. Why is it needed? Because salka daitachamina. I would have thought that in the earlier steps, when is the first time that the kohen is mentioned? When he receives the dam. If I were to ask you what part of the carbon brings atonement, we should know the answer. The placing, the throwing, the pouring of the blood on the altar. The dam brings kapara. To the point that if the dam was put in the mizbeach, and wrongfully, nothing else was done, no part of the animal was burnt at all on the altar, the kapara happened. That's an important thing. In other words, we might have thought that, of course, that which is essential to atonement, for that you need to have a kohen. All of the other parts of the avodah, which is bringing up the fats, for which you have to flay it, and you have to dismember it, and all of that, it's not ma'akev. If it's not ma'akev, you might have thought you don't need a kohen. So maybe the reason why the Torah writes in pasuk 7 that kohanim, that's because we want to tell us because anything other than the avodas hadam is not ma'akev. You would think like the kohuna. So therefore, right, Kamash Malon, so the pasuk writes in pasuk 7 that you do have to have kohuna. But maybe the hefshet and the nituach also needs to have kohanim. So therefore, the Gemara says that just quoting the pasuk of Chizkiah, just quoting, won't be enough. What do we have to add? Let's go weiter. When it says in pasuk 7, right after it says v'nosnu b'nei aharon hakohen esh al mizbeach. Here again, it says a step without mentioning a kohen. It says v'orchu eitzim al ha'esh. Then we have in pasuk 8. Now we're back to the question. So the beginning of pasuk 8's mentioning of kahanim remains is extra because since mikabala ve'elach mitzvahs kahuna, so it's actually the inference is not from the kohen's mention by the fire in pasuk 7, but yes, now that we already established that even that which is not ma'akev is also by a kohen. So begin pasuk 8 by writing va'orchu hakoyan va'orchu es hanasachim. Arrange the parts. So why is that needed? L'ma'utei after the v'nituach. So the Gemara accepts that the opening mentions of Bnei Aharon in pasuk 8 is extra. The problem is, how do you know that it excludes hefshet v'nituach? L'ma'utei sidur shnei gizrei eitzim. Maybe it's telling you that the placement of the wood does not have to be done by kohanim. Makes a lot of sense because just like Chizkiah was using the mention in pasuk Zayin, kohen, to exclude that the pasuk prior does not need to be done by kohanim. Let's use the same logic. The mention of kohuna in pasuk 8 should exclude the end of pasuk 7. What does it say at the end of pasuk 7? Va'orchu eitzim al ha'esh, and va'orchu eitzim al ha'esh does not mention kohanim. Now I want to add something. We're going to have in Parshas Tzav another pasuk where it says Ubied Elyahu hakoyen eitzim abayker babayker. The kohen has to put the wood as mentioned in Tzav. So how can you even have a havamina that the shnei gizrei eitzim does not have to be done by a kohen? I know that by Yikra it's not mentioned kohen, but in Tzav it does. So the answer for that is is that the pasuk in Parshas Tzav, Ubir Olah HaKoyen, is referring to the morning Talmud. We had that yesterday. We had it in the last year. The Ba'orchu Eitzim Aloei Shir in Parshas Vayikra is alluding to the afternoon Talmud. And here we go back, maybe in the afternoon Talmud, remember, Ubir is Lashon Yachid, right? Ba'orchu is Lashon Avin, which means that in the afternoon, 2 Kohanim, each one for a piece of wood. Gesund Tehei. How do you know Kohanim? They maybe means one non-Kohen and one non-Kohen. So maybe it's excluding the putting the 2 blocks of wood. You got to exclude something, but you don't know which one. Answers the Gemara, no. We're speaking about a carbon. So when we are excluding, when God is saying the word to teach you a din by inference, we're speaking about a carbon, exclude the carbon. Flaying is the animal. Dismemberment is the animal. Placing wood is not the animal itself. The Gemara says, no, not good. Because it says the words va'archu. They should arrange the parts of the animal. So arrangement should imply that there is another arrangement, which is arranging the woods, ultimately putting the 2 blocks of wood. Arrangement. That should be the inference. That's a kash. So says the Gemara, no, it's not going to be that way. Why? Because the Amar Mar, when it says now we're going to focus on Pasuk 13, guys, we have to amend. You appreciate this. In Pasuk 13, we have the 2 steps. We have step number 1 is Vihikriv HaKoyen, Es HaKoyel, and then it says Vihikriv. When it says Vihikriv HaKoyen, Es HaKoyel, right, that's the emendation here on the side. Vihikriv HaMizbecha. So what does that refer to? Zuhay Lochas Eivarim Lakevech. The Torah is telling you again you mention Kohen. Why are you mentioning Kohen? It's to tell you that only the Hilachas Eivarim Lakevish Hu Debai Kohuna. We're going to have a double inference. This is why did it. And what does that imply? Hilachas Eichem Lebai Kohuna. That whoever is going to bring the blocks of wood towards the altar does not have to be a Kohen. But that also implies that the placing of the 2 woods has to be done by a Kohen. Because if even the placing of the woods on the altar does not need to be done by a Kohen, then why do you have to say that a non-Kohen can bring the eitzim close? He can even put it on the fire. Because if God is saying the extra word kohuna, not to tell you what God is saying explicitly, but the word is being said to imply something. If the implication is already known, so the whole thing is kawa, so why are you telling it to me? So it's like a double implication. God is saying like this, it's moidedik, that the limbs have to be taken by kohanim. You know why Hashem said that? To tell you that the wood does not have to be taken by kohanim. You know what that means? That it does have to be placed by kohanim. That's why God has to be mechadesh, that even though the placement of the wood has to be done by kohanim, but you don't need a kohen to take it near. Beautiful. So now we actually know that the wood always has to be placed by kohanim in the morning and the afternoon. So now we come back. So Pasuk 8, not the Pasuk of Chizkiah. The mention of Kohuna in Pasuk 8 must be implying that not Hefshet the Nituach. So now Ba'archam Lamali. Because don't tell me it's coming to teach you that the woods do not need to be put by a kohen. They do. So now we know Lemute Hefshet the Nituach. That's great. So Ba'archu Eitzim Aloeish is teaching us Ba'archu that Hefshet and Nituach does not need to be done by kohanim. Now, Atkan, it's mamish great. There's a problem. The problem is that all of that was learned from the extra ba'archu b'nei Aharon HaKehanim Eis HaNesachim. That was extra. And again, that's the rule. You only can learn something from inference if the statement that God made is not needed. You would know it already. So then you say, God said it to teach you something in between the lines. We have a problem. And the problem is based on some information that we don't yet have. But someone in the yeshiva remembered that there is another entire limud that's learned from Pasuk 8. The whole Pasuk 8 is needed. Let me just give you by heart what that is. How do you know that when it comes to a lamb, that there are only 6 kohanim, a total of 6 kohanim that bring up all the parts? That's the 5 in which we have the machloikas plus the intestines. That's learned from Pasuk 8. We're gonna read it inside soon. So someone says, I'm sorry, the whole house collapsed. Because maybe the limud that I learned, that's not mentioned yet, is taka correct limud, which it is. So the whole pasuk 8 is not extra. If God has to write something for itself, we cannot learn anything by inference. So we're back to the kasha. So Elo v'hiktir hakoyin as hakoil. So we are going now to pasuk 9. To pasuk 9, when it says at the end that a kohen is the one that burns everything. Again, why are you mentioning kohen? We already established Kabbalah by a kohen. We already established that even the steps that are not essential to kapara, kohen. Forget about pasuk 8. Why does it have to say again the word kohen in pasuk 9? Aha, that's it. That's it. And that's the limud. Now says the Gemara, when it says v'hikriv hakoyin es hakoil hamizbechom, that teaches us zu oilachas evarim lakevish, like we learned before. And what does that imply? That oilachas evarim lakevish hu deboy kuhunam, but oilachas eitzim loy boy kuhunam. And the reason why God has to hint that oilachas eitzim don't need kuhuna is because the shiddush legitz eitzim need kuhuna. Says the Gemara, hold on. V'nosnu legufei. The nosne is needed to tell you, this is pasuk 7, that what? That only kohanim can put the fire. Now we're going to go to, we mentioned in pasuk 8, this is the limud. What do we learn from pasuk 8? Why do we mention kohanim? It's to teach you a number. Va'archu is in plural. They arrange. The Torah mentions b'nei Aharon. B'nei means not son, but the sons. 2. When it says the words kohanim, another 2. Notice we're only mentioning b'nei Aharon kohanim, not to tell you that it has to be done by a kohen. We're saying 2. That is from where we learn l'madnu l'tlesha ton shisha. How do you know that a total of 6 people take up all of the body parts plus the kirbayim from the pasuk 8? And again, that's why we can't infer from the b'nei Aaron HaKehanim that hefshet nituach. The maskana was from the vehiktir that the kohun is mentioned by the Haktorah. The only problem is with this last limud. How can you say that the entire pasuk 8 is mentioning just to speak about lashon rabim 6? This whole parsha is about bakar. When do we only have 6 people? By the tleh. Remember that? By the ayol, we have 11. By the bakar, we have 24. This is a bomb question. So Amar Rav Amnuna, hold on. When Rabbi Elazar heard this limud, he says, how can you say that the source of 6 is from the beginning of Parshas Vayikra? No. Hayve ben bakar, ksiv. It says clearly, uben bakar, the Mishnah says, esrim ba'arba boi, not 6. So answers the Gemara, you're right, but Rabbi Elazar himself figured out the answer. What's the answer? That the pasuk, in pasuk 8, the words that he did not mention, when he says that the parts are put, the head and the fats, that we need, the head and the fats, right? Remember, you have to put the fats to cover the incision of the head. But the end of pasuk 8 is extra. Alo eitzim, asher alo eish, asher alo mizbeach. Who needs that? Alo eitzim, asher alo mizbeach. All of that is extra. And you know what that's hinting? That even though we're speaking about an oila that's coming from a bakar, but what oila is the first oila that goes on the woods that were put on the fire on the altar? The morning tamid. The morning tamid, the Torah says, has to be a lamb. Ezel davar she'ema by eitzim and eish and mizbeach daf chav zayin amid beis. Have a oimer zel teled, the morning tamid. Done. So Gavaldik. So we have many mentions of Kahuna, and it is only the final mention of the Hiktir HaKoyin that's not needed to tell you how the Koyin has to do the Haktorah. Hefshet and the Tuach does not need to be done by Kohanim. That ends the first half of today's shiur. And now, Mamash, Amid Aleph, Amid Beis, the entire Amid is going to go now to a new din, like we mentioned in the intro. Rabbi Yechanan made a statement, and let's chazer. We had before Machlokes Rav and Levi, that's how we got into it, whether if a non-Kohen who removes the deshen, the daily Haramas HaDeshen, the daily Trumas HaDeshen, whether a Zor is Chayiv Misa. For sure, a non-Kohen should not do it. We already mentioned Chayiv Malkus. But you also have the Chayiv Misa. So we began, even though Levi adds something, with the following premise. I think it was Daf Chav Daled. What was the premise? That for what are you Chayiv Misa? on a avoida that is a placement avoida. Which means generally, even Levi is moida. Generally, any avoida that is of removal, like removing the ashes from the inner altar, removing the residue of the wicks in the menorah, removal should be done by a kohen, but there's no chiyuv misa. Number two, it has to be a avodas tama, a concluding service. Now you're going to chop over here that whatever was done in the arrangement of the mizbeach, where do you say that the last day's avodah ended and whatever was done later is considered a new avodah? What's the end? Don't forget that the shechita has to be done by day. And once the blood is sprinkled by day, you can bring up the fats at night. But when the kohen would go up in the morning, as we learned in the beginning of the Perek, that after they established a payos for the Trumas Hadeshen, they threw in a couple of additions, including the Sidur Hamaracha, the organization of the top. And the kohen who won that piyos also put the 2 blocks of wood in the morning. One kohen put 2 blocks of wood. How do you view that? Is that the end of the night or is that the beginning of the morning? And that's very significant because if it's the concluding of the night, then if a zor does it, he'll be chayav misa because that was the avodah tama. If you view the preparation of the altar as the beginning of to get the new animal parts on the fire, then it's the beginning of the avodah. Pashat. So says the Amar Abbas Yom Rabbi Yechanan. This is version number 1. That Rabbi Yechanan is saying that Zor Shesider Hamaracha, the Sidur Hamaracha was done after he did Trumas Hadeshen. Trumas Hadeshen. Sidur Hamaracha means that he organized, he arranged the top of the Mizbeach. And just to know that after the Sidur Hamaracha, he placed the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. In the morning, the one kohen placed the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. In the afternoon, 2 kohanim placed, as we learned above. So that it was heard, and we said in the name of Rabbi Yechanan that a non-kohen who chayiv. Chayiv means chayiv misa. That's how we will learn this entire Gemara. Now, what happens if a non-kohen did it? What happens if he did it? So ketzad hu oisa. And ketzad hu oisa means, is it rectifiable? What do you need to do? So the words are, he takes it apart. It's mashma, the zor, and he puts it again, and he reorganizes it. So the Gemara says, 1 second. If you're trying to rectify something, now are we rectifying the sin of the zor, or are we rectifying the altar? If we're rectifying the sin, how does that help for him to take it apart and put it back together? He'll make a balagan and then or mayahanile. So the Gemara clarifies. It means Ella Parika Zor, whatever the Zor did, it's not only that he's chayav misa, that's on the person, but we cannot benefit from that which he did. Now, who should make the effort to undo? The guy who did it, the Zor, and then v'soidra koyim. But the sin of the Zor was chayav misa because he was misader de maracha, which must mean, listen, guys, we definitely can view this as avodas matana. Because he's organizing. He's placing the ashes in one pile. He's placing one pile where it should be, the other pile where it should be fine. But an avodah tama, that's a chiddush. Guys, for this to be considered an avodah tama, we must say that the Sidur HaMavracha is viewed as the last avodah of yesterday. And the placing of the 2 woods is like the beginning of the new day. Then it's called an avodah tama. Problem is, Maskevah Rav Zera, is there an avodah that's kosher at night? And nevertheless, if a zor does it, he's chayav misa. That's how we'll learn. A psul of a zor on the level of misa? No, he should not be chayav misa. That's what we'll learn. Why is that? Because anything that can be done at night is not that significant. That's the kasha of Rav Zera. So the Gemara now challenges Rav Zera. Azoi, what about Eivarim u'Pedarim? That everyone is moided when we had the sugya both of Rav and Levi, before Levi added even Trumas Hadeshen. What did we learn? We learned that if a zor puts up the chalavim be'evarim, if a zor brings up the animal parts or the evarim and the pedarim, the zor is chayav misa. We know that evarim or pedarim may be put up all at night. So what's the premise of Rav Zera is not correct? Says the Gemara, no, Rav Zera's premise is correct. If something is called a avodas laila, there should never be a chiyuv misa on a zor. You know why? If a zor brings up the evarim or pedarim, he will be chayav misa. You know why? Because really the evarim or pedarim should be brought up during the day. It's connected to the carbon that's brought during the day. The Torah extends. If you didn't do it at night, you can do it at night. Remember that? We learned from Psachim that this can be done even if it's on Shabbos, that you can bring up the Eivadim Apedarim on Shabbos. Remember that? Because Chaviva, I think it was Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita. I think that was the Lashon over there. It's viewed as Soif Avodah the Yomamahu. Again, the Gemara is going to challenge the premise of Rav Zera. Now, this question obviously is only going according to Levi. According to Rav, if you remember, just a few days ago, Rav Taka holds that Trumas Hadeshen is not Chiyuv Misa for another reason, because it's removing. But Levi added Trumas Hadeshen. Again, Trumas Hadeshen is done at night. It's done before it got light. We even learned, remember, on Yom Tov, the Trumas Hadeshen was done not before midnight. Avodas Laila. So the Gemara again says, no, we don't view it that way. Chilas Avodah Diyamamihi. We view it as the beginning of the day's Avodah. And now we're quoting another statement. The Amar Abasi, Amar Rabbi Yechanan. And guys, you'll remember that the Gemara challenged this statement, Eino Chanami. But our sugya, to back up Rav Zera, will go by one of the versions that we had above. That Rabbi Yechanan said, in spite of the fact, let's just give out the intro, that if a kohen was working 24/7 at Tzaddik, he washed his hands by the shiur Sunday morning, and he worked Sunday morning, and he worked Sunday night. He was never Masiach Das. He never left the Beis Hamikdash. Nevertheless, by dawn, he has to wash his hands again. However, on that said Rabbi Yechanan that if he got up, and when he got up, he was Mekadosh Yadav Araglov for the Trumas Hadeshen, and that's done before the crack of dawn. When it gets light, he doesn't have to do a new Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. And according to that version, why? That version was that we viewed the Trumas Hadeshen as the beginning of the day service. So this again will not challenge Rav Zera, which means Rav Zera's question is good. Rav Zera is telling Rabbi Yechanan, how can you say that the Sidur Hamaracha Azaras Chayev Misa, Sidur Hamaracha is Avodas Laila? Now, Chevra, there's a big question over here. I'll speak that out in a moment. Let's go back. The El of Elakasha. So now the Gemara amends what Rabbi Yechanan said. Elakiyit Maracha Yitmedar. Amar Abasi, Amar Rabbi Yechanan. Zor Shesidur Shnei Gizrei Eitzim is Chayev. The Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, which is done after the Trumas Hadeshen. You're telling me that the Trumas Hadeshen is already considered the day service. Now the Sidur Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, again we're gonna get to the is considered by him the Avodah Tama. It ended the preparation. Makes sense. It ended the Sidur Hamaracha, and it's considered the day Avodah, and therefore Hayav Avodah Sayomi. Now, this is what Rabbi Yechanan said. I want to speak out the following. If we are saying that the Sidur Hamaracha is called the Avodah of night, we got a kasha. You know what the kasha is? You know when they did the Sidur Hamaracha? After Trumas Hadeshen. If we're going with the version that Trumas Hadeshen, even though it was done at night, but it's considered the beginning of the day's Avodah, and we're saying, and also the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, the placement is also called the day's Avodah. So why wouldn't the Sidur Hamaracha be called a day's Avodah? It's done, guys. Mamish Gavaldik Kasha. It's you have the Trumas Hadeshen, Sidur Hamaracha, and then the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. So Tosfos gives a Gavaldik answer, and it's good to have just a concept. Don't think that they only did the Sidur Hamaracha once a day. Every time the top of the Mizbeach became in Ivrit Yakira Balagan, they needed to make a Seder there. It was also done during at night. It wasn't only done after the Trumas Hadeshen before the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. And therefore, since the Sidur Hamaracha also was done at night, we never view this as a daytime avoid. It's not about the daytime. And don't forget that de facto, the Sidur Hamaracha that we are talking about is done before it's light. It's done before the Shechita. The Shechita was done by the crack of dawn. All of this is done prior. So b'metzias, it's not night. You can't connect it to the day because it's not about the day. The Sidur Shnei Gizrei Eitzim is connected to the day. You don't put Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. Now, of course, if you ran out of wood, you put as much wood as you needed throughout 24/7. But the placement of the two woods, you know what it says in the Torah? We just quoted this on Obir, Allah HaKohen Eitzim, Baboiker, Baboiker. The Shnei Gizrei Eitzim is called a daytime avodah, not the Sidur Hamaracha. Okay, so now says the Gemara, Maskevla Rava. Now Rava again is making this question based on a premise. The premise is not spoken, but we have to chop that any avoida that is an avoida kama, and it's a avoida that needs to be done during the day. Let me word it differently. Any avoida that is an avoida for which a zar is chayav misa, because it's an avoida tam, because it's an avoida smatana, and it's an avoida that has to be done during the day. That is what makes that avoida significant enough for it to need a lottery. So if we are saying that the Sidush Negizri Eitzim, if Rabbi Yechanan is saying Yizar is Chayev Misa, we also said that it's Avodas Yoim, so it meets all of the preconditions for it to be considered significant. So now asks Rabbi, based on that, Elameata to buy a pious. So why did they not make a lottery for the Kohen who's going to win placing the 2 blocks of wood? Now, we're going to question Rava because we just learned this. But Rava didn't have the Gemara the way we have it. And the Gemara is going to say, you Rava forgot a detail, which we should not forget because we just learned this. And what the detail? That there was a lottery for it. The one who won the Truma Sadeshen also won the Sidush Negitzri Eitzim. There was a prize for it. Ishtamit say, he forgot. He forgot all the Tanya. And in the Sidush Negizri Eitzim. So yes, a girdle was required. Now the Gemara now goes on by saying, aha, I understand the question of Rava was based on the premise that what needs a pious? 2 things. Aleph, a daytime avoida. Number 2, an avoida for which is Zaras Chayev Misa. So asks the Gemara, the Memra, the avoidas yoim by a pious, because he only asked it on Rabbi Yechanan. Elama'ata. But a avoida slaila should Rava agree does not need a pious. We learned that one of the steps of the second pious wasn't just a step. Guys, remember we learned you had 6 kohanim involved by a lamb, the 5 body parts, and then you had and not all of them, but some of them was the eivarim upedarim, the fats, and there was a lottery for that. So again, the Gemara answers: bringing up the body parts could be done at night, but it's not a nighttime service; it's a daytime service. Soif avoided the Yoma, even when it's brought up at night, it's considered the end of the day avodah. Trumas Hadeshen. Trumas Hadeshen again is done at night, and again the kasha is not the kasha is not and there was a pious, yeah. So it's a daytime avoid. It's a nighttime avodah. It's done at night. So why do we have a pious? Now we could have answered that it's the beginning of the daytime service. But the Gemara says, no, Mishum Maisa Shahaya, that's the beginning of this whole Pedic. By the way, there was never a pious for it. They only made a pious because tragically, the foot race did not lead to some sort of Seder that was healthy. Again, says the Gemara, now we're going on the second implied criterion from Rava. So we resolved the Avodas Yoim. The member of the avodas yoim vishizor chayv oleh. Only then do you have to have a pious. But even if it's an avodas yoim, but if ein zor chayv oleh misa, because Rabbi asked on Rabbi Yechanan, he's without Rabbi Yechanan, without chayv misa, we buy a pious. I got now a weiter akasha. Guys, we make a pious for the shchita. Yes, shchita is done during the day, but a shchita is ksheira bezor. If not only is he not chayev misa, takel lechatchila. And just the Gemara, Shana Shchita the Tchilas Avodah. Shchita is different because it's the first actual step of the Avodah. Now you can argue that the Trumas Hadeshen is Tchilas Avodah, but no, the Shchita is taka the first thing you do at day because everything else was done physically when it's night. This is such an important statement. I want to share the Rabbi Akiva Eger when in the whole Sugya and Shabbos about the miracle of Hanukkah, and the Hashem made a nes. And that's the ikar reason why we celebrate Hanukkah, not for the winning of the war, but from the miracle of the oil. Now, if God would not have made a miracle, what would have happened? What would have happened if He would not have found pure olive oil, or if it would have burnt out on one day? Then we learned so many times together that any communal avodah, we say either Tumah Tchuya B'tzibur or Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, even if it's only the Chuya, we would have lit them in later. We would have lit them in later. So what's the big to do? That we found the Pach Echad Shemen. Rabbi Akiva Eger writes from this Gemara that when you begin something, even though shechita k'sheira b'zar, but the fact that it's the beginning, it gives the fact that this is the first step, it has extra chashivus. So he writes that after the desecration of the Yevanim, and we were making a Chanukas HaMizbeach, and part of the Chanukas Beis HaMikdash, you can't do, even though Tumas B'choya B'tzibur, not for the first time you're lighting the menorah. So that's why there was a need for us to find Shem and Tahar, the Maldekavot. There's some extra chashivos, and Hitaka says that we would, if maybe on the second day, but the fact that we found the Pach Echad Shem and Tahar, that was essential, because it was the beginning of the inauguration. Okay, let's go to the end of the Amar. So Amar Zutra. It says in a Mishnah, now this Mishnah will have the next daf, in the beginning of the next page, that the Mamuda, the one in charge of organizing the Seder Hayoim, Rashi is going to write it's the Skan Kohen Gadol, he would say, go see if the time for Shechita is here, which is mamash by the crack of dawn, with all the details we'll learn in next Amid, in order to begin the Shechita. Now, and someone had to go to the roof, and they would have to look towards Chevron and Agansamais. So what does that mean? That for what needed to be done a day? Only the Shechita. The Ilo Zman Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, which was the step done before the Shechita, Loiketani. So again, does that not mean that the placement can be a placement at night? In other words, when does the wood have to be placed? Now that we established the second statement of Rabbi Yechanan, that what did Rabbi Yechanan say? That if a Zor placed the wood, he's chayav misa. And Taka, there was a pious for that, because it's an avodas yoim. If it's an avodas yoim, then why is it that for the placement of the woods, they didn't ask a client to go look and to see whether it's already the day? They only asked that to know how to make the shechita. So does that not imply that the placement of the Shnei Gizli Eitzim can be done at night? Now, if it can be done at night, then Hadar Kosher L'Duchten, then why would Rabbi Yechanan say that a Zar that does it is Chayiv Misa? And by the way, it says in the Chumash, Ubiyer Aliyah HaKoyin Eitzim B'Boker B'Boker, but still, it doesn't seem from the Torah Shabbat Peh that it must be done in the morning. And more than that, Tosfos says, guys, remember B'Boker B'Boker? You know what B'Boker B'Boker can mean? B'Boker can mean not Boker. B'Boker can mean 10 Boker LeBokroi. Remember that whole thing? How do we get that the whole shita of if something falls off the Mizbeach, that if it's before Chatzos, after Chatzos, B'Boker could mean not morning, a morning to the morning. And maybe Taka, the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim is called Avodas Laila. And that's going to refute Rabbi Yechanan. So the Gemara says no. Rabbi Yechanan stands. The wood also can only be placed, the Gashmi is B'Boker. B'Boker doesn't mean late. B'Boker means after the crack of dawn. Do you know why in the next Pedic, we're only going to focus on the Shechita Gavaldik? Because if you do the Shechita prior to the crack of dawn, what are you going to do? Nothing. You ruin that animal. You're going to have to burn it, the Beis HaSreifa. There's no tikkun. If a kohen, because of his zealousness of doing the avodah as soon as possible, places the Shnei Gizlim before it's dawn, and then you chap, it's not dawn yet, no problem. Take them off and place them back. That's why the Mishnah doesn't mention it. But Itaka has to be done in the morning. Shchita, leis leitakanta. Therefore, the Mishnah speaks about that they would announce this whole system as we'll learn in the next daf to make sure the shchita is not done before the crack of dawn. But the wood, since the islotakanta like tani Gavaldik. So what did we conclude? Again, we have two things. We have Rabbi Yechanan and we have Rava. And we're going to need to remember this for the next daf. Rabbi Yechanan initially was understood to have said that if a zor is misader de maracha is chayev misa, and we refuted that. Rabbi Yechanan could not have said that. Why? Because siddur hamaracha is not looked like it's not an avodas yoim, it's an avodas laila, even though it was done after the Trumas Hadeshin. Trumas Hadeshin is considered the beginning of the day. Doesn't matter, like we mentioned, because it could be done at night also. And what did Rabbi Yechanan say? What was the conclusion? That if a zor was misader the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, yes, he'll be chayav misa. That's number one. Number two, we have what Rav is really, Rav's conversation is based on a premise that for what do you need to make a pious? What demanded a pious? Two things. Number one, it should be an avoida, which is so important that if a zar does it, he'll be chayav misa. And number two, an avoida for which it's considered a avodas yom, a daytime avoida. For an avoida that would be viewed only as a nighttime avoida, they will never need to have a pious, God willing, to be continued. Okay, great. Right, guys, we're going to fly back to Agadata, big Agadata in the next stuff.
Baruch Hashem. In the end, is there any, which avodah is considered an avodas laila, based on what we just learned? The Evarim Vidarim are not, and the Shnei Gizrei Eitim are not. So what's an avodah laila?
L'chayra the Siddur Hamarachim. In other words, like this: if not before, when they still made foot races, and they didn't yet make it pious for the Trumas Hadeshen, which already included two other steps, then maybe they made a pious for the Shnei Gizrei Eitim. But they never made a pious for the Siddur Hamarachim. That it must be this. And then when they made a pious for the Trumas Hadeshen, if you remember, it wasn't enough to get a coin out of bed. It was lazy. So they told them, once you do that, you'll do the Siddur Hamaracha, you'll do the Shnei Gizrei Eitim. They added a few things. Maybe the Taka explains why just adding the Siddur Hamaracha wasn't enough, because there was never a lottery for it. So they took something else for which had a lottery. In Mistama, there were other steps. It's just not coming to my head. All right, Chevra, I know it's before 7, but let us start. Wow. Chav Chesam Adbeis, you can spend a whole year on in the Agadata, as we'll see in a moment. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yoma Daf Koyach, Daf Chav Ches. We will begin on Daf Chav Zayin on Adbeis. We're going to have another version of what Rab Zera challenged Rabbi Yechanan with. So quickly to review, Rabbi Yechanan made a statement regarding a certain step of the avodah that if a non-kohen does it, is chayav misa. And initially we had the girsa, Amar Avasi, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, that if a zar is organizing or if he's arranging the maracha, a zar is chayav misa. Then Abzeda challenged him, and based on the challenge, we clarified what Rabbi Yechanan said. Not that if a zar is masada the maracha, he's chayav misa, but if the zar placed the shnei gizrei eitzim, he's chayav misa. That will be the same. We're going to have a new version of what was the challenge of Rab Zeda against Rabbi Yechanan. So we're going to have a different challenge, but the same conclusion. We're going to have the statement of Rava based on the same premise that we learned in the previous daf, that Rava is really explaining why certain steps demanded a lottery and other steps not. And the premise of Rava's interaction with this whole sugya is all that will remain mamish the way we had it before, that an avodah has to be a daytime avodah, and avodah has to be avodah for which a zar is chayav misa. Any avodah that meets these two criterions is considered significant, and that avodah needs to have a pious, and the back and forth, a lot of the back and forth will be very similar to what we had on that Chav Zayin Amud Beis. On that Chav Ches, as you see in Amud Aleph already, we begin the third chapter, Amalehem Hamamuna. Now here is where we transition back from the daily avodah back to Yom Kippurim. Don't forget, guys, we're learning Masechtas Yoma. And even though the second chapter was not about Yom Kippur, it was about the 4 daily payasos. So the Pedic will begin about that which happened every day, but we're going to mamash come back to Yom Kippur. But as the Mishnah begins with what happened every day, so aside of the payasos, there was a step of needing to make some sort of physical verification that indeed it's already daytime enough halachically to do the shechita. And as we will see, the shechita of the Koren Talmud did not need to happen by Netzachama. And you can't just say the words Alois HaShachar. We're going to have various steps, a very early crack of dawn, which was early enough to do the daily shechita, and a whole seder and a whole conversation between a mamuna and between someone that went up on a roof. That will be the Mishnah. And on that Chav Ches Amud Beis, we're going to have very important agadatas, statements. Some of them will be shocking. For example, we learned in Brachas that when the 3 tefillos that we daven now, like Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, so we have like 2 versions, whether it's Keneged the Avos, remember that, whether it's Keneged the Avodim the Beis Hamikdash. but mincha is associated to Yitzchak. The Gemara says that. Or mincha is associated to the Talmud Shel Beinu Arbaim. What do we have in B'chai Yesod Vayetze Yitzchak Losuach Basada? Guys, Andaf, Koyach, Yoma, Chavches, the Gemara is going to tell us that mincha is the prayer of Avraham Avinu. And we're going to speak a lot about Avraham Avinu. And we're going to speak about another very important foundational rule that Ein Lemedim Mikoidim Matan Torah. So, for example, when we do a bris milah, even though it's called the brisa shel Avraham Avinu, like the Rambam writes very strongly, why does a yid do Avraham Avinu? Because God Almighty commanded us in Mount Sinai to do a bris milah. We do it because of Sinai. We don't do it because of that which happened prior. Ein lemeidim mikoydim matan Torah. So the whole concept of davening mincha, or details of it, and mincha is going to be referred to as the Shaloisa, the Avraham, that whole thing will be problematic. And we're going to have a Gavaldika answer for that. What actually could we learn from before Matan Torah? We're going to have the famous statement that Kiyam Avraham Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula Achla Nitna Afilo Eruvei Tafshilin. And guys, this is a statement that we're going to have on Daf Koyach from an Amoira. I think it's from Rab. We'll get there. But whoever remembers the last Mishnah in Kedushin, a Mishnah says that. Why do you need to have an Amoira that repeats what it says in the Mishnah? We'll learn the Marsha at least by heart, that no, that the Lashon in the Mishnah in Kedushin is Asa Avraham Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula. The Lashon of the Amoira, I think again it's Rav, it's Kiyim, it's something even greater. We'll speak a little bit of Pi Chasidus. Why do we emphasize Afilu Eruvei Tafshilin? We're going to have also a very foundational insight in how do we define Torah Shebal Peh. And in the bottom of Chav Chesam Abeis, if we'll have enough time, we'll begin to speak about the difference between moonlight and sunlight, and that is going to lead us into also a lot of Agadah, which God willing will continue tomorrow on Daf Chav Tes. Okay, Chevra, let us start on Daf Chav Zayin on the days. Ika da Amri again. The Ika da Amri is based on the original. We're going back to the beginning. First, we have Amar Abasi, Amar Rabbi Yechanan. If you have to remember, look on top of the Amid, that Rabbi Yechanan said that if a non-Kohen arranges the top of the Mizbeach, he's Chayiv Misa. Chayiv Misa B'dei Shamayim. And let's quickly chazer what we had, I think it was on Daf Chav Dalid, as a cloud. What steps of the Avodah are steps for which Azar is Chayiv Misa? Number one, a Avodas Matana. A placement Avodah. Siddur Hamarach is called Avodas Matana. Even before we speak about the placement of the 2 blocks of wood, which comes after the Siddur Hamaracha, but you're placing the ash pile in an organized way. You're organizing the different pyres. We're coming off like Bo'emer, Rabbi Chaim, we're organizing the Maracha. That's called a placement Avodah. And number 2, it must be considered the last Avodah, the Avodah Tama. And also to appreciate that, because you can argue, how is the Siddur Hamaracha the last Avodah? But you put the woods on the Maracha afterwards. So according to the original understanding, the Pshat will be that the Siddur HaMaracha is the end of yesterday. It's called the end. The placement of the Shlugr is that's the beginning of tomorrow. So we could view the Siddur HaMaracha as a Avodah Tama. That was all the beginning, the Havamina. But Rab Zera challenged Rabbi Yechanan. So on top of the Amid, the challenge that Rab Zera had was, it's an Avodah Laila. How can it be that there's an Avodah Laila that's kasher? And by the way, that question stood. And therefore we changed what Rabbi Yechanan said. Now we're going to have another girsa of what Rab Zera. There's another challenge on Rabbi Yechanan. So Ika da Amri, the mask of Rab Zera against the original understanding of Rabbi Yechanan. Forget about the fact that it's Laila. Again, let's go back. In order for a Zar to be Chayav Misa, aside of it being an Avodas Matan, it has to be an Avodas Tama. Now let's challenge that. Let's challenge what we keep on saying, that how is it an Avodas Tama? It's not an Avodas Tama. After the Siddur HaMaracha, you have to place the 2 blocks of wood. The opposite of Avodah Tama is Avodah Sheyesh Achre Avodah. That's the words that Chazal say. That the Sheyesh Avodah, Sheyesh Achre Avodah, and yet Upsula Bezar by Upsula Bezar means, of course, Upsula Bezar. Upsula Bezar by death? No. And the Siddur Shnei Gizlei Eitzim is considered that which comes after the Siddur HaMaracha. And more than that, okay, that's the kash. Now, guys, we have very difficult 5 lines. we're not skipping it because it's difficult. It's not difficult. But Rashi, because of the difficulty of the very intrinsic back and forth, Rashi writes that we're not goyres the first 5 lines. We're not shying off it, but we're going to follow the version of Rashi. And now the Ella, no, we don't. We're not goyres that, because the kasha of Rab Zera, according to Rashi, is like we mentioned, the Siddur Shnei Gizrei which is done after the Siddur Hamaracha. It's not an Avodah Tama. The Gemara doesn't have to prove anything. And there was no challenge against Rab Zera. This kasha is Gavaldik. The Siddur Hamaracha is not the end. It's not the Avodah Tama. Nekuda. Okay, so therefore Ella, because of this kasha, by the way, the first version also it clarified that we had the wrong version of Rabbi Yochanan. That is enough. It's not an Avodah Tama. So Ella, and indeed, now we go back to what we learned in the last year, that we had the wrong. Rabbi Yochanan said something else. Rabbi Yochanan didn't say that if a Zor is Masada de Maracha, he's Chayav Misa, he's not going to be Chayav Misa. Now we have 2 reasons why. What we learned in the last year, because it's called Avodah Slaila. It's not called a day's avodah. Number 2, because it's not an avodah tama. You view that, that's not the end. But what Rabbi Yochanan did say is, Zor, Shesiver, Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. Yes, he's Chayev Misa. Hoyel ba'avodah tamahi. Now this is already Gavaldik. Now you can ask, guys, what comes after the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim? What's the first thing that's put on the Mizbeach? The limbs, right, of the Talmud Shel Shachar. Now, there has to be a point where we say today ended and tomorrow begins. So you can't ask that the placement of the Eivarim of the Talmud Shel Shachar comes after the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. We don't say that. It makes sense. We view that the Talmud is a new day. The last thing is of prior to that is called the placement of the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. Maskiv la Rava, now comes Rava. And Rava is based on the same premise that we had in the last year, that we're not going to focus on, it has to be a daytime avodah for you to have a pious. Number 2, what elevates an avodah to the madrega, that it needs a pious, that it's an avodah that if a zor will do it, he will be chayav misa. So now that Rabbi Yochanan is saying that if a zor brings up, is mesaded, the 2 blocks of wood, the zor is chayav misa, and it's a given that it's considered a avodas yoim. Based on that, Elamato, he has a kasha to buy a pious. And really, the question of Rava was simply, in the last year, was we used the words that Rava forgot. Here, the Gemara is not saying that he forgot, and I think I know why. Because according to this version, Rava never forgot. He never knew the Baraisa. Much better. Rava, if he would have known it, he wouldn't have forgotten it. So the Gemara answers, no, does it not need a pious? So you don't know the Baraisa. I'll tell you the Baraisa. The Hatanya, we talk alert. We learned this above. That was in the beginning of the second page. That Chav Beis. That Misha Zach B'Trumas Hadeshen Yizke B'Siddur Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. So the Gemara says, no, he knew the Baraisa better. Rava meant to ask, why are you making this as an add-on? Why are you making it as an add-on? Rava's asking you, Faisu La B'Fnei Atzma. That's Gavaldik. He didn't forget. He didn't overlook. Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, if Rabbi Yochanan would not have made a statement, we have the answer. If a Zor would not be Chayev Misa, Rabbi would not have asked this question. But now that you're saying that he's Chayev Misa, based on the other unspoken premise, it's considered a daytime avodah. It should have its own pious. So the Gemara says, no, that we already answered. Kida Amrinon. What did we already answer? That after they said no more foot racing, after we said you got to make a pious even for the Trumas Hadeshen, after we established that the Yetzer Hara of sleep is much stronger in the morning. It's at night, even when you're tired, it's easier for you to say, I'll go to sleep later. That's a big part of our mistake, that we go to sleep too late. To get up in the morning, remember that? That's much harder. So once they made a lottery, which was done in the morning for the Trumas Hadeshen, the Kohanim were not motivated enough, or they were counter-motivated with the desire to sleep. Only adding Siddur Hamaracha would not be enough. Why? Makes sense, because there was never a pious for the Siddur Hamarach. And we also mentioned in the last year, why do you think the Siddur Hamarach was only done in the morning? It was done many times. whenever the top of the altar became disorganized, they reorganized it. They didn't make a pious for that. They just did it. So just adding on the siddur was not enough. They needed to add on something chashiv. What was chashiv? Something that demands a pious b'fnei atzmai. And what is that? That's the ubir aleh hakoyin eitzim baboiker baboiker. How great is that? So take the Gemara lememro. Again, this is the premise of Rava's question. So Rava is farenfit. We answered this question, but we are now going to challenge the premise of Rava. Is Rava saying that only an avodah that's tamo, and an avodah number two that a zor who does is chayav misa? Only then do you need to have a pious, which is why Rava said the words elo ma'ato. He only asked this question after Rabbi Yochanan made a statement, which implies that the premise of Rava is that if ein zor chayav ala misa, without Rabbi Yochanan, Rava would not have asked the question, why by a pious bomba kasha again that is shchita. Shchita, my friends, is an avodah that not only a zor is not chayav misa, a zor is allowed to do the shchita. It's almost a lachatchila, even though we did speak that by a carbon sibur, we prefer a kohen. But it's mamish kashay de bezor. So the one answers, we had this all in the last year. So that's again the back and forth. That's similar. No. Shana shchita the tchilas avodah di imamahi. So even though it would have been kosher with a non-kohen, but if a kohen is doing it, the beginning has a unique chashivus. And again, remember again the other premise of Rava's statement that only avodah tama boya pious. But if you have an avodah, that's not called the concluding avodah. But what is it? If it's an avodah sheishachre avodah loy boya pious, connecting Gemara, papa harei evarim upedarim. You cannot say that it is the final avodah. Now, guys, why would you not say that the evarim and pedarim is the final step? What comes afterwards? Who remembers? What is the avodah that comes after the burning of all of the animal parts? I'll tell you what, the Trumas Hadeshin. Because the Trumas Hadeshin is to remove the ashes of that which was burnt. And for the evarim and pedarim, they made a pious. And why? It's not the avodah tama. It's an avodah sheyesh achre avodah. So answers the Gemara, we don't view it that way. We view the evarim and pedarim, the end of yesterday. The Trumas Hadeshin is new. But next question, Baharei Trumas Hadeshin. That Trumas Hadeshin should not be considered an avodah tama. Why not? Because what does he do after the Trumas Hadeshin? He's misaded the maracha. Now, by the way, this kasha obviously is only on Levi. According to Rav, remember, according to Rav, there's no pious. I'm sorry. According to Rav, a zor is not a chayav misa. But according to Levi, that a zor is chayav misa. But and we l'chura, it's not an avodah tama. It's not an avodah tama. So why do you have a pious? So the Gemara says, "Fakert." Now you understand why initially there was no pious. There was no pious because based on Rava's point that you only make a pious for a avodah she'ein achre avodah. We don't view Trumas Hadeshin as an avodah she'ein achre avodah. No, and they made a foot race, but Navas then go back to the beginning of the Perek. Mishum Ma'aser Shahay. And now again, Omar Marzutra V'Tema Ravashi. Now it's going to be not as a kasha as we had in the end. So we say in the name of Ravashi, Afanon Namitanino. I will bring a riot like Rabbi Yochanan. That the placement of the wood is considered a concluding avodah. That's what we're focusing on. Yesterday, in the last daf, we learned that as a kasha. Now it's fakir arayah. Why are we viewing chayav misa? Because it's a concluding service. If it's a concluding service, if that can make sense, then it doesn't have to be done during the day. By the fact that it says in a few lines from now that so what needed to be done after during the day? The shchita, that which comes before shchita, including the Trumas Hadeshin, including the placement of the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, like Tani, which taka means it can be done at night. So that's why we view it as a avodah tama. It's the end. Says the Gemara, that's not a raya. And also the way we learned at the end of last daf, because you could perhaps say that this has to be done by day. We're going to teach baboiker kipshutai by day, not 10 boikroi laboiker or boiker labakroi. The reason why the Mishnah doesn't mention it is because even though it should be done during the day, but if it was not done during the day, it can be rectified. Remove it and put it back on. Shchita cannot be fixed. And that's why the Mishnah speaks about Shchita. And that's why Ketani in the next Mishnah. But regarding the Sidur Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, is Leitakanta and therefore like Tani. But maybe again, it has to be done dafka, and indeed it has to be done dafka during the day. Tumas Hadeshin can be done during the night, but the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim has to be done during the day. But we're not refuting Rabbi Yechanan. The conclusion is, guys, that the Sidur Hamaracha, if it is done by a Zor, not Chayev Misa, the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, if a non-Kohen does it, yes, he'll be Chayev Misa B'dei Shamayim. But this we say, Hadan and Allah, Baruch Shana, we'll come back to you, Perek Sheni, and now we are starting the third chapter. And as we mentioned in the intro, it's only the beginning of the Mishnah that continues with the daily Avodah on the Beis Hamikdash, and we will right away segue into Yom Kippurim. Okay, says the Mishnah. Omar Wahem HaMemuna. Now, HaMemuna is an administrator. Who is the administrator? So there's really a machlokes Rishonim. We spoke this out when we learned Talmud as well. We spoke this out in the beginning of the second chapter. Here, that just Rashi holds that this Memuna was Taka the Skan Kohen Gadol. That was one of his jobs, the deputy of the Kohen Gadol. And what is needed here? We need to make sure that the Shechita is done during the day, not nates, yes, alois. And from when in alois? Look in your calendars. Today you're going to see there's the Magen Avram's alois, there's the Geraz alois. It's not so pashut, even alois. So what happened? He said, "Suru, go out, and see." Imigiyazman shchita. What does going out mean? Doesn't mean he went out of the temple complex. Rashi teaches is important. So alachoima, oyalagag. Go up. Going out means going up. You know, we say that. Seyulamad in the Haggadah. Seyulamad, when I was a kid, that a yeshiva bacher wants to be matzliach, he has to leave his home. Go to yeshiva. Say going out is going up. Go up on the wall. Go up on the roof, and to see if the time of shchita came. Let's go back to the Rashi. What's mana shchita? Says Rashi, shchita satanit koloimet im heyer hamizrach, not netzachama, but is there any light in the eastern sky? Now, how do you know that shchita has to be done by day? We say it. What's the source? Says Rashi. Shashchita psula b'layla. Kedichsiv. It's amazing. Not in Vayikra Aleph. All the way later in Kedoshim, it says biyoim zivchachem. That's the source. Biyoim and zivicha means shchita. So that's the source that shchitas of kachim has to be done by day. So like this. Let's go back in the Mishnah. In Megia, if take it's. We'll see what step. If the eastern sky is lit up, so the code, what would the observer, we'll call him the Roy is the observer, and then the Mamun is on the ground. The Roy is up, the Mamun is down. The Roy says, Bar Koyi, literally shining, Barak, right? But it means that dawn, it's halachic dawn. Masya ben Shmuel Oimer, Masya ben Shmuel, aside of him being mentioned in the Mishnah, so he's a Tana, but he was actually a Mamuna. He would not say, is it light? The words that he would use was, Hey, Pnei Mizrach. Now the next words will be clarified on Amud Beis. Whether he added, which is a little bit more light. Not any light in the Mizrach. He already was a little bit more specific. Or he would ask, hey, for the Mizrach. And if it was, so then the guy on the roof, the observer would say, Acha b'chevron. And then he would say, good. There's different ways of learning back and forth. We'll go back to this line of the Mishnah on Amud Beis. Some of it was said by the Mamuna, and some of it was said by the Roy. Now the Mishnah is asking, I don't understand. If you need to know when it is Alois, what did they do before they had the calendars today? You would look up in the heavens. Is there some morning light or not? Why did you need to have a guy going to the roof? So says the Mishnah, because one time something happened. Allah ma'oid halavana, the moonlight over the horizon came up. And when you were only standing on the ground of the Azara, the Dibu, Sheheir Mizrach, based on that erroneous premise, the Shachatu was Satamit. And then they realized that they shechted it before any light of the sun was on the horizon, and that invalidated the carbon. So therefore, they decided that we need to have a visual observation from the roof, and that resolved it. Now we're beginning. Now we're coming back to Yoma. Rabbeinu HaKadosh was brilliant. The emes is that whoever did the avodah has to go to the mikveh. Narvas then, since we're learning Masechtas Yoma, and who did the shchita, the Kohen Gadol? And by the way, as we mentioned in the previous Pedic, according to the shita is the Balamoy that we are following, that the Kohen Gadol did every step, so then he would go to the mikveh before the Tumas Hadeshen. But we're focusing here on the shchita. So Hayridu Kohen Gadol Beis HaTefilla. During the year, the Kohen that did it. Whoever did the shchita, if shchita k'sheira b'zar, if they did it even for tchila, then the non-Kohen would go to the mikveh. Another interesting deal. Guys, where was the mikveh? Where was the mikveh for the Kohen Gadol? Remember, we learned it was on the second story. It was on the second story. We actually called that whole chamber the Machashev's chamber because it looked like Kishuv. The fact that they got water, they didn't even see the pipes. Doesn't matter. When you go into a mikveh, what do? You go down. You go down until you take steps down. It's very significant. Just like when we daven Shemona Esrei, it used to be that the Baal Tefillah went down. The whole idea of mikveh is bittul. Bittul means to lower your ego. That's a lashon of the Mishnah. And now the Mishnah goes back to a general rule. So we segue back into Yoma, but now we're coming back. That the following rule was in the Beis HaMikdash. Whoever needed to have a bowel movement during the day, during the night, then Kol Tefillah. You have to go to the mikveh. If every time someone urinated, for that you didn't have to go to the mikveh, but yes, you have to wash your hands and your feet from the kiyar a lot more in the end, God willing, in the Gemara. Let's go to the Chav on the base and let us start. First part of the Amid will be about the detailed conversation between the Sgan, or let's go with the Mishnah, between the Mamuna and the Roya, the observer. You want to be a Roya, you have to step up. Look, Tanya Rabbi Yishmael Omer, that the expression that the observer, the Roya, would say, in our Mishnah we had the words Bar Koi. He says, Barak Bar Koi, the dawn has begun. Now, it's not just a semantic. This is either making this even earlier or a little bit later. That's the way I understand. And because all of these shitas have to do not only with the words that were said, but they really have to do with how much light do you need to have in the eastern sky. Rabbi Akiva says, not Barak Bar Koi, which is very little light compared to Rabbi Akiva. No, Allah Bar Koi. Allah means the dawn has risen. That's our beautiful expression. The dawn has risen. The dawn has risen is after the Barak Bar Koi. I want to add something, another detail, that if the observer would have gone up even higher, think about this, the higher up you go, the further you see, the more light there is on the horizon. Al Piruchnius and Big Tzadikim, they see even further. What is further to them appears closer. If we'll have time, remind me before the end that it's an easy yomid. There's a Gavaldik Amaisa mit the Mittel Rebbe with that. That there was steht Echer zet weiter. So really, Rabbi Akiva maybe was on a higher madrega. So he felt, even though physically the roof only had that whatever height it had, but if you're higher, then actually you'll see more light. And we want you to see more light, not Barak Bar Koi, but Allah Bar Koi. The next Tana, again, these are Tanaim that we normally don't hear the names, is Nechuma ben Afaki Shoin says, no. It needed to be even more lichtig. Not enough to say Allah Bar Koi. He needed to say Af Bar Koi Bechevron. All of this, we're going from the least amount of light, we're going L'choyr and a Seder. Even more light. If you don't say that, it's not good enough. And Masya ben Shmuel, who was mentioned in the Mishnah, who this Braisa says it wasn't just a Tan in the Mishnah. He was the Mamuna ala Payosas. Now, guys, we have to know, Rashi says that the Mamuna was the Sgan. So that goes into what we spoke about in the previous chapter. Machlekes Rishonim. Who was Mamuna on the Payosas? Was it the Sgan or was there someone Mamuna ala Payosas? But anyways, he says that the observer has to say, Heir Pnei Kol HaMizrach Acher V'Chevron. And Rabbi Yehuda Meseder says, Noch Heir Pnei Kol HaMizrach V'Chevron and the Yotzu Kol Ha'am Ish L'Malachti. It's so light that people are going to work. Now we have a kasha. Again, let's go back to the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? Why did they have to go to the roof? So we wanted to say, because since you really do shechita from the earliest part of dawn, and you can mistake moonlight with sunlight, as we'll see more details here on the days today. But if, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseda, that it has to be so light in Hebron that people are already going to work, come on, you don't have to go to the roof to see that. That you can stay on the ground. Talking about a Yochi, that Naga lay tuva. Naga, guys, psachim, that base. This is Shengunuk lichtik. So the Gemara answers, no. That not that he needed for it to be light enough that people are going to work. For that, you don't go to the roof, but liskard pay alam kameninam. When you go hire day laborers, I know here in Los Angeles, there are certain places you go hire day laborers. So you go to hire them before it's really light. Elama, it's one madrega beyond the last one. So really we have either Barak Barkoi, Ola Barkoi, Af Barkoi, Bechevron's Gavalik. Every Tana here wants it for it to be a bissel more lichtig for you to do the shchita. When it comes to the coming of Mashiach, we're going to follow Shitas Rabbi Yishmael. We should already begin the Beis HaMikdash with Barak Barkoi. We don't have to wait until the next steps. Okay. Now from here until the two dots begins Agadah. Now listen to these words. Amar Rab Safra. Says Rab Safra. So Loi say the Abraham, my dear Jews, does not mean Shachris, which would be the easiest way to learn Pshat. You know, from when do you do the Shechita? The Talmud Shel Shachar. From when can you begin Shachris? No, we're speaking about the afternoon. We're speaking about the Mincha. That so Loi said the Abraham means from when can you daven Mincha? From when the walls become dark. Now here on this Amud, you have Rashi on both sides. What does that mean? It's amazing. From noon. Not from Mincha Gedoyla, what we call. We had this whole Sugi and Psachim. From noon. Now, how can you tell me that the walls are dark at noon? So Rashi explains, when you have a wall, so yeah, in the first half of the day, the eastern side of the wall is light because there's nothing blocking the light. When does the eastern side of the wall become dark? Don't say from when it's afternoon. I don't need for the sun to be to the west of the wall for the eastern side of the wall to become black. You know when the eastern side of the wall becomes dark? From noon itself. Because when there's noon, the sun is on top of the wall. It's no longer on the east of the wall. And Rashi uses the words that the edge of the top of the wall that goes down into the wall, that blocks the sunlight of hitting the eastern side of the wall. Avram Avinu, who was the one from whom we learned Zrizin Magdim al Mitzvahs, he davened Mincha ASAP. Now, Bachlal, we're going to speak about this just a bit. We spoke about this in Brachos. When should we daven Mincha? Is it ideal to daven Mincha Gedoyla? Big machlokes and Periscope, or is it ideal to daven Mincha Ketana? We're going to go that here the ideal is to daven Mincha Gedoyla, but not the way we have it now in Halacha. Rab Safra is saying no, it's called the prayer of Avram. So we should daven like Avram. Avram Avinu daven Mincha the moment it was noon, before the afternoon. Now, before we go on, again, there's no Tosfos, but we have Tosfos Yishanim. And let's go, and I hope we have it. I have it all the way in the bottom of the Gemaras. The Gemara is really, the Tosfos is troubled by this. You know, again, it goes against the Gemara in Tefilla Sashachar. Guys, Minchas Yitzchak, you're not going to find this in any other place. So I said, Abraham, Michi Mashchere Koisle, the Im Traimar, look at Tosfos Yishanim, Ha'amrinim, Bepedek, Tefilla Sashachar, Yitzchak, Tikein, Tefillas, Mincha. Shneimar Aziri state in Parshas Chayesara, right when the shidduch came back, Vayetze Yitzchak lo suach basada. Gewaldig. Two answers here. There are many other. Two answers here. Yes, Shlomo like this. The Achar shetikna Yitzchak. Yitzchak enacted mincha. Who listened to Yitzchak? Even Avraham Avinu. Hoya oimra gam Avraham and kach Perush Rabbeinu Tam. But let's go into this detail. We are not focusing on the prayer itself, but it's the hemshech to our whole sugi is they davened, they did the shechita in the first moment. Barak bar koi, shecht. Avraham Avinu davened mincha the first moment. The mincha is Yitzchak's. But since Avraham Avinu davened it, and he was the one that davened it ASAP, he was the one that said, you know what, as soon as possible means mincha, from when the eastern wall gets dark, which is Chatzois itself. You daven by Chatzois. So that's why it's called Solois Avraham. That's one answer. Another answer, Inami, that actually Amar Rebbe is a Rishon. That Rebbe says the first one that davened mincha before Yitzchak was Avraham Avinu. He davened Shachris and mincha. We'll see, and Maider. Nor was then, you know why the Gemara in Barachas calls it Yitzchak Tikein Elo Shaloi Aso Klal L'Chol B'nei Beisai. Avraham Avinu davened everything. But you know what? The Kinderlach, his children, he says, Chevra daven Shachris. Avraham Avinu did not educate his children that they have to daven mincha. Yitzchak was misaking that no, Yid has to daven Shachris and mincha. But who was the first one that davened mincha? Avraham Avinu. That's this answer. And the proof is, as we'll see in the Psalm, it says Rebbe, here Rebbe in Toysus. The tikkun means Yitzchak was not the one that invented it. He was not the first one that did it. He was the first one that says that we are all bound by it. But who formulated and who davened? The first Avraham Avinu. And the proof is, as we have in the summit. Just amazing. So we're coming back to the Gemara. So again, Absafra says that we're speaking about shechting ASAP. Avraham Avinu daven mincha noon. And what he really, L'cho'ur, is trying to say, that therefore when we daven mincha, daven it from Mechimashchere Koislei, from Chatzois itself. Omar Rabbi Yosef, Anan me Avraham Mekraim v'Nigmar. Are we going to learn this from Avraham? Now, Rashi says, what was bothering Rabbi Yosef? Rabbi Yosef says that the level of Zerizus of Avraham was so beyond us that it's not fair for us to have that standard. There's Zerizus, but we're speaking about Mamish Chatzois. Can we be that Zarus? That's Rashi. Look inside the Aruch. By me, it's Mamish on the side, on the right side. Avraham, the Aruch writes that Hey nilmad ma Avraham shikia ma Torah achle nitna ve'ein lanu lilmoid elam minig neviim. It's a much stronger question. Not how can we aspire to be like Avraham and Zerizus. No, there is a rule that we keep Yiddishkeit not because of the patriarchs, but because of our Nevi'im, beginning with Moshe Rabbeinu, was Mesakim. That's the abbreviation. And furthermore, this is so important. So the Aruch brings a Tosfos in Moed that quotes a Yerushalmi. This is not written in the Bavli, but this is a very important klal. And we have it over here. The Ein Lemeidim Mikoidem Matan Torah. You cannot learn from before Matan Torah. So answers Rava. Now I want to speak out by heart what the answer will be according to the Aruch's interpretation. What do we not learn from before Matan Torah? A mitzvah. Bris Milah, because God told Moshe Rabbeinu. We call it the Bris of Avraham Avinu, but because God told Moshe Rabbeinu. But whenever we're not learning a mitzvah, we are learning how to do a mitzvah. Zerizus is not a mitzvah. Zerizus is an attitude. Attitudes we learn from before Matan Torah. And so, mincha we have to daven because there's a tikkun from Chazal, beginning earliest from Moshe Rabbeinu. We don't go before. But now the question is not if to daven mincha. The question is how to daven mincha. How early to daven mincha. Zerizus we take a learn from Avraham Avinu. And indeed, Amar Rava, yes, Tana Gamam Avram. We have another din that we find the Tana that we learned the behavior from Avram Avinu. Why do we learn from Avram Avinu? The Tanya. It says in the Torah, in Parshas Tazri in the beginning, the Torah doesn't say what hour in the day. Nevertheless, the Tana tells us Malami. As long as it is by Yom Hashmini, you have some sachem, right? Right? There's another Vayashkim, but anyways, let's go over here. There's Vayashkim Avram Abikim when he was pleading for God not to destroy the Sodomites. Bottom line is that yes, we learn from Avram Avinu's reasons. So what was Rabbi Yosef's kasha? So Elam no, Rabbi Yosef meant to ask something else. Rabbi Yosef hako kasha lay, but it says the Tanach Mishnah Psachim. That's the kasha. When did they bring the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim in the Beis Hamikdash? The earliest. Remember, normally in the whole Mishnah we had, the earliest was with Erev Pesach Shalias B'Shabbos. They did it. I'm sorry, on Erev Shabbos I meant. So then, because you can't cook it, you can't roast it on Shabbos. So you needed not only to shecht it, you needed also to prepare it before. So Nishcha, the earliest B'Sheish U'Machzah. They began the avoid of the Talmud of the afternoon, B'Sheish U'Machzah. If you remember that the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim, Aleha Hashleim Kol HaKarbanis Kulam, the assay of Hashlama. The only exception is Korban Pesach. So to start doing the Korban Pesach, you have to sort of say, do already get out of the way, not in a negative way. You have to do the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim. So the only time they did it the earliest possible, and they needed to do it the earliest possible, it was the Sheish U'Mechza. That's Chatzois U'Mechza. That's 12:30. So Shos Maniyos. And it took 1 hour, so V'Kara V'Sheva U'Mechza. So that was Rabbi Yosef's kasha. If the earliest you can daven mincha is noon, and this is connected to Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim, so why didn't they bring on Erev Shabbos, Erev Pesach? They should have brought the Korban Tamid at Chatzois from the 6th hour, not from 6.5. So the Gemara answers my kasha. This is not a kasha, and it's 2 answers. It's going to look like 3, but it's 2 answers using different lashonos. Answer number 1. It only became dark at 12:30. Guys, we spoke this out. The walls of the Beis Hamikdash were what we called in English tapered. They were not straight. Not only were they very thick, but they were built in a way where the bottom was wider than the top. What do we need? We need for the eastern wall to become dark. So if you have walls that are straight, the moment it's midday, like we spoke out in Rashi, the edges of the top of the wall block the sunlight from going on the eastern part of the wall. It gets dark. But when you have a tapered wall, the sun has to move more to the west for the eastern wall to become dark. So if they would have had watches, clocks, if they would have measured times the way we measure it today, maybe the Utaka would have done the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim noon. Avram Avinu, Daven Mincha noon. There they used the sun. They and the walls were built in a way that they only saw that it's noon when it's really already 12:30. And number 2 and number 3, which are the same, using different expressions. Inami Shami Avram, because the Itztagninus Gedoyla Hoysebeliba. He was very well versed in astrology. You can't, in other words, you know what we don't want to do? We don't want to do it too early. Sometimes you go early. Early is great. Too early is not good. Saying start davening whenever you are now. Don't daven a minute early. It's not fear. So Avraham Avinu was certain that he can begin midday and he won't get it 11:59. But most people don't have that level of knowledge in the movements of the heaven. So if they're going to do it the first moment possible, they are opening themselves up of accidentally doing it prior to the first moment prop, and that's not good. So therefore, they added a half an hour. Inami is like the same expression. Mishum dezakein. Don't say Avraham Avinu was an astrologer. That was prior. No, use another. Avraham Avinu was a zakein, means that he's a shekana chachma, and v'yoshev b'yeshiva hava. He sat in the yeshiva. I want to maybe say sitting in the yeshiva means maybe that he didn't even need to go and look at the darkness of the wall. The Maisa from the Alter Rebbe in jail, that he knew exactly what time it was because he was already seeing the different nishmoros, the Shem Havaya by day and by different combinations. He was a Yoshev Yeshiva. He knew Baruchnius when is exactly noon. We don't have that knowledge. We have to look at the physical sunlight. We have to delay it a drop. Now,
Right.
where do we?
That's just a quick question.
Sure.
We're asking from Erev Pesach that falls by Shabbos. That's when they do it by 6.5, like we learned the Psachim.
Yeah.
But based on this, shouldn't there be a question that every single day they should do it at 6.5? Okay, so not 6, I get it, because you need to know. But if you need to be Zorez, so why isn't every day, not just Erev Pesach?
So what we learned from Psachim is that since Aliyah Hashlim Kol HaKarbanos Kulam, once they brought the Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim, you cannot bring other karbanos. They wanted to afford people the opportunity to bring their other karbanos. They just needed to balance it with the fact that Pesach needed to be done after the Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim. So how much time do you need for the Pesach? And accordingly, do the Talmud prior to it. But making the Karban Talmud 12:30, which is what they did only at a Pesach, at a Shabbos, that had a downside. Then the other people's karbanos could not have been brought anymore. Let's go back. So how do you know that Avram Avinu, look at the Lashon, he was sitting in the yeshiva, the Amar Abchama Bar Chanina, Berebi Chanina, Meyem Shalav Yiseinu, like Parsha Yeshiva Meyem, we never stopped learning in a yeshiva. Hoye b'Mitzrayim, Yeshiva Imoim. How do you know that? Shenema, Lech ve'osafta Ziknei Yisrael. How did you have Zikanim? Zikanim is from the Chevra that are sitting and learning. Hoye b'Midbar, Yeshiva Imoim. Shenema, as it says, Esful Yeshiva Mishpashos Balo, Ziknei Yisrael. And don't think it began in Mitzrayim. Let's go back. Why were the people in Mitzrayim sitting in the yeshiva? Avram Avinu Zakin v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva. Shneimar, as it says in Chayesod, this is the second time, an extra word. Avram Zakin, the biggest compliment, not old. Zeshakan l'chachma, meaning he sat in the yeshiva. Baba Yom Yitzchak Avinu Zakin v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva. The first medium line. Shneimar, as it says in Parshas Toldus Vayihi Ki Zakin Yitzchak. Not he got old. No, he was sitting in the yeshiva. Yaakov Avinu Zaken v'yeshiva. Shneimar be'enei Yisrael koivdu mi zoiken. It's amazing. Taka, when you sit in the yeshiva, your eyes, you wear glasses. Eliezer, Eved Avram, even more. Not only our patriarchs, even Eliezer was a Zaken v'yeshiva. Shneimar, as it says, Vayimen Avram al Abdo. You write Parshas Chayesod, Zekan Beisoy. What means Zekan Beisoy? Hamoshe b'chol Shaloi. It means that Eliezer was sitting and learning. And furthermore, Amar Abba Lazar, when it says Hamoisho, now that we said Zakan Beisoy means he was learning, that's the Hamoisho. Hamoisho means that Hamoisho b'Torah Rabbi, that he was such a master in the Torah that he heard from Avram Avinu that he had the right to be an authoritative posek. He was allowed to paskin dinim. He was allowed to teach to other people. And that says explicitly, because when it says regarding Eliezer, now we know that Eliezer was a Canaanite. But it says who Damesek Eliezer. Now normally Damesek Taka means Damascus, but Eliezer did not come from Damesek. He was from Canaan. What does Damesek mean? Shedoyle umashke mitoyrose shel Rabbi Lachem. Doyle umashke. That's Damesek. That he not only learned from Toifeach Almanas Lahatfiach. Okay, and let's go back to so now that we're learning about so first of all we established that yes, Zrizus we learned from Abraham. Why don't we daven mincha mamish noon? Because we're not going to get it like he got it. We might do it before noon. In the Beis Hamikdash Bechlal, it was not shayach because the simon of the sun took another 30 minutes. But now that we're speaking about Avraham Avinu, Amar Rav says, in addition to what it says in the last Mishnah in Kedushin, that Asa Avraham Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula, says the Marsha, Asa can refer only to the Ramach Mitzvah Sasei. Rav had another version, or that's his version in the Mishnah. If you open up a Gemara, I think it's the last daf Pei Beis Kedushin, you'll see on the side, Kiyem, or Rav added, not only Yasa, but Kiyem Avraham Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula, and he has a raya. What's his raya? Shenemar. And this is a statement that we haven't told us. This is Hashem speaking to Yitzchak about the greatness of Avraham. And Hashem tells Yitzchak that Ekev, Asher Shoma Avraham Bikoili. Now the vav of the agreement is essential. The three words that it says Vayishmoer Mishmarti, Mitzvoisai, Chukoisai, and Toirosoi. Oh, that means all of the mitzvahs, not only the positive mitzvahs. Because Vayishmoer Mishmarti Bechlal Shmira means negative mitzvah, negative, and my mitzvahs. Amalei Rav Shimon Bar Chia Terav, hold on. the word mitzvosai maybe refers to the Sheva mitzvahs, which we were taka bound by. So answers Rav, answers Rav, no. Don't only say that the mitzvosai refers to the Sheva mitzvahs because Avraham Avinu was commanded a milah. So right, he goes back with discussion. So ema Sheva mitzvahs to milah. And by the way, that would explain the following. It says mitzvosai and chukoisai. A bris milah is a chok. A bris milah is a chok. So that would work. Mitzvosai means Sheva mitzvahs. Chukoisai means bris milah. So that's why Amalei, you're right. Mitzvosai, the chukoisai is not written in the Gemara, but the final word doesn't fit. The final word is toirosai. We say toirosai because that's at the end of a pasuk. But toirosai, we'll see as lashon avim. V'toirosai lamali, that word is extra. Is that ayah that he kept everything? Amar Rava v'tema Ravashi. What's pshat toirosai in plural? Ki Avram Avinu afilo eiru ve'tavshilin. Wow. Shenemar toirosai in the plural. What does plural mean? Guys, this is such a liner. Now let's understand the following, guys. Eruvei Tavshilin, the beginning of Beitzah, when Yom Tov goes into Shabbos, we learn that on a biblical level, yes, we are allowed to prepare food from Yom Tov to Shabbos. Midrabanan, we may not. And then they figured out a way how to permit it. And that is if you begin preparing for Shabbos prior to Yom Tov. So let's say here in Chutz La'aretz, in the common 2 days Yom Tov, so let's say Rosh Hashanah, Yom Tov will be Thursday and Friday. You're going to have Thursday and Friday. So on Wednesday afternoon, you prepare a cooked meal, a baked meal for Shabbos. And then you declare that everything that you will be doing Friday afternoon for Shabbos is only a hemshech from the Eiru B'Tavshilin. That's a midrabanan. And here we're saying that Avraham Avinu kept all the mitzvahs, even Eiru B'Tavshilin, because Torah Sai is Torah Shebachsav and Torah Shemal Peh. Now we got a problem because Torah Shemal Peh normally means biblical. Torah Shemal Peh means what the emes, the Torah Shemal Peh. Torah Shemal Peh is Allah Moshe Misinai. Torah Shemal Peh is the Yugim Midos and the many other Midos. But here we find something amazing. If you look in Masechta Bey in the beginning, I think it's in Daf Yud Beis, whenever the Gemara speaks about Eiru B'Tavshilin, the Gemara says, Shenemar Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kachay. And even though that the proof that you should remember the day of Shabbos from Wednesday, like the Gemara says, if without Eiru B'Tavshilin, you might use all of your good food for Yom Tov and you'll forget about Shabbos. Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kachay is called a asmachta because Eiru B'Tavshilin is a midrabanan. What we are learning here on Yoma Daf Koyach that even an asmachta is called Torah Shemal Peh. It's taka midrabanan, but since they were soymechit on a pasuk in the Torah, this is called Torah Shemal Peh, and that's the Torah side. And al pi Chasidus, why are we emphasizing that he kept even Eiru B'Tavshilin? There are so many other midrabanans that are asmachtas that Avraham Avinu obviously kept because Eiru B'Tavshilin ma'arev Eiru to connect. We are connecting Shabbos to the weekday. Connecting Shabbos to the weekday is really the whole kavanah of the giving of the Torah. Connecting Shabbos to the weekday is bringing the holiness of Shabbos into the choil. And al pi Chasidus, that is even greater than the keeping of Shabbos. Of course, Shabbos is when we elevate ourselves, but the kavanah of Dira B'Tachtonim is being ma'arev Shabbos into the week. And even though Avraham Avinu was unable to do a koydem matan Torah, there was a gzeira, but actually we spoke about the bris. Like, why did Avraham Avinu, who was kiyam kol ha'Torah kula, right, even Eiru B'Tavshilin, so why did he not keep a bris milah? That's the big question until God commanded him. He kept Eiru B'Tavshilin before he was 99 because that's the whole point. Because since the kavanah was even Eiru B'Tavshilin, and ultimately the only way we have a koyach to bring the kedusha, down into the world is only when there is a commandment. So, and since a bris milah you only do once, for him to make a bris milah real in a way that you make the flesh itself holy, for that he needed to have a commandment of God. Okay, let's go right to be able to finish until the end of the Amud. Okay, now we're going back to the back and forth that we had in the Mishnah between the Memuna and the observer, the Roya. So Masya ben Shmuel, that we already learned, he himself was a Mamuna, he said, and he answered, there was something that's ambiguous. So the Gemara asks, Man Omarein, who says Hein? The one that's standing on the roof, the observer, and it sounds like he's asking and he's answering. No, you don't. The same one who asks should not be the same one that answers. And Lashon Chazal is who chalim, who mefashin. You dreamt and you interpreted. Doesn't work that way. It's also good to know if you want to have your dream interpreted, it's better to have someone else interpreting it for you. You cannot be the dreamer and the interpreter. With the whole sugya we had in Haroy attack over there at the end of Barachas, how to properly interpret dreams. So he cannot be the one asking, is it light until Chevron? Yes, no, it doesn't go that way. Ella, like this. So yes is being said. If the one on the roof is saying until Chevron, so the guy on the ground is saying yes, he's on the ground. How does he know that? So the Gemara says there's two ways of learning it. And the both ways. What happens? This is the Seder of the Mishnah. Number one, Omar Iyu. Iyu, guys, is the roof man, the roya. He says, hey, the whole eastern sky is lit up. But now, the Omar lay, so the kohen on the ground, the Mamuna says, so the Omar lay, so the guy on the roof says, yes. That's one way of learning it. So there's a back and forth. The one who says, hey, is the one standing on the ground. What's shot? Omar Iyu, the one on the ground asks, hey, kol pnei kol mizrach. The guy in the roof says, not only yes, he says, because that's needed. That's needed according to the sheet of Abba of Masya ben Shmuel. So the moment he didn't just say yes, he added so now the one on the ground says yes, gut gesagt. I needed to hear that. And another link, why Chevron? Chevron is where the Avis are buried. Let's go back to the Zrizus. Let's go back to our topic. So we are unable to daven mincha noon. We'll get it wrong. But Shchita and Kahanim are Zrizim. They did it the first moment that we can do it. Where do we learn that from Chevron? Beautiful. Now, the Mishnah asked, why do you have to go on the roof? I mean, what vantage when Danny is not so impressed? He has maybe a better word we'll share later. So the Amalei, now the Mishnah, why do you need that? You look and you're standing on the ground. You talk, what difference does it make? Ground, roof. When it comes to these manim, like when you are in Manhattan in these big skyscrapers, what does Shabbos come in for you at a different time? Does Shabbos come in later because you only see the Shkia? That's a big question in Allah. Is there such a thing? What did we learn? I think in Brachas that Yehi Chelki from the taking in Shabbos in Teveri. I think we had that lashon, and I take Shabbos out in Sfas. So we spoke about it then because the people in Chevron they are lower. So for them Shkia looks earlier. So they took in Shabbos earlier. People in Sfas, they're in the mountain. They saw the end of Shabbos later. So Yehi Chelki to take in Taka could be that it goes according to what you see. So you're going on the roof. But the Gemara says, so what happened once that there was the moonlight, and they thought the moonlight was the sunlight. How is that possible? The Rebbe says, guys, don't forget, we're not looking for nates. We're not looking to see the sun or to see the moon, which would have been the confusion. We're looking at a shaft, at a ha'ara of the moon. They confuse that with the ha'ara of the sun. How can you confuse it? If they don't look the same. And Rebbe is saying, Timur Shalavainim, all of the rays that come out of the moon, they rise up like a stick. They look straight. So if you're sitting in a place and you're by a mountain and the moon is about to come up, it can look very light, but you will know that it's not sunrise, not from the amount of light, but from the way the light is shining. It's very narrow. It's like a laser relative to the sun. It's like a palm tree. It's like a stick. Timur Shalchama, but the shaft, the ha'ara of the sun is maftzia. It diffuses. It's much broader. So how did they ever confuse it? So answers the Gemara. that day was Yom HaMa'unan. It was a cloudy day. Now, it wasn't a cloudy day in itself. Rashi adds that there were certain openings in the clouds. Now, this is what happens. When you have light that's coming from above the clouds, which is sunlight, which is moonlight. So if there are no clouds, even when you don't see the ma'od itself, you see the ha'ara, then the moonlight and the sunlight are very different. But if they are both being blocked by the clouds, and then the light goes through the cracks of the cloud, they look similar. It is diffused. Even the moonlight, it's almost as if the light wants to go in, and it's getting stuck by the clouds. So it's looking for the crack, and boom, and it enters there. And that one time is why they changed the system. So that on a cloudy day, the sun is felt in every place. Because when you're telling me that when there's clouds blocking the sun, it's like the dam blocking the water. So whenever there's an opening, then the rays go in a lot stronger. So that affects even the sunlight also. On a cloudy day, there's more sunlight. What do you mean by that? Just to finish with this, we'll continue, God willing, tomorrow. If you want to spread out skins to dry. Now, skins should really dry better, quicker when they are in the sunlight. So during a non-cloudy day, put it in the sunlight. If there's clouds, put it anywhere, because the light that seeps through the cracks in the clouds are stronger than the sunlight. Or inami l'chedadar Rava, going back to Pesachim, Rava told us that on Pesach don't need flour, not in direct sun, nor in water that was warmed by the sun, because then it will become chametzik a lot quicker. So if it's a non-cloudy day, you can eat it outdoors, just don't do it in the shade. But if it's a cloudy day, no matter where the sun is and where the sun is not, since it's cloudy, wherever the sun rays do pierce through the clouds, it's even stronger. And therefore, it will affect the same quickening of the chimutz. We'll stop over here, God willing, to continue tomorrow more about the koyach of the light through clouds. Gewaldig, Kevin. A lot of I got it tomorrow.
Maybe